There are stories that history books never wrote down, stories that lived only in the mouths of old grandmothers and grandfathers, passed from one generation to the next around dying fires. This is one of those stories. And if you think you know what courage looks like, if you think bravery only belongs to warriors and soldiers, then you have never heard the story of a quiet woman named Winona and a Lakota chief named Red Hawk. Because sometimes, the bravest thing a person can do is not fight. Sometimes the bravest thing is to kneel. And sometimes, the most powerful thing a leader can do is not raise his weapon, but open his arms and say 3 simple words: "Stay behind me." This is not a fairy tale. This is what happened when 2 worlds collided on the open plains, and one woman's humble act changed the course of an entire tribe's survival. The year was 1868. The world was changing fast, and nowhere was that change more violent and more painful than on the Great Plains of North America. The Lakota people had lived on those plains for hundreds of years. They followed the buffalo. They raised their children under open skies. They prayed to the Great Spirit and honored the earth beneath their feet. Their lives were not easy, but they were free. And for the Lakota, freedom was everything. But freedom was under threat. The white settlers were coming from the east in numbers that no one could have imagined. They came with wagons and guns and papers that said the land now belonged to them. They built forts and roads and railways across land that had been sacred to the Lakota for as long as anyone could remember. And with them came soldiers. Soldiers who did not come to talk. Soldiers who came to push the Lakota off their land and force them onto small, barren pieces of ground the government called reservations. The Lakota were not a people who surrendered easily. They were warriors. Their chiefs were strong men who had earned their positions through bravery and wisdom. Among these chiefs was a man known as Red Hawk. He was not the most famous chief. His name was not written in the newspapers of the East the way Sitting Bull or Crazy Horse would later be. But among his own people, Red Hawk was deeply respected. He was tall, broad-shouldered, with deep lines on his face that told the story of a man who had seen much suffering and much beauty in his life. His eyes were dark and steady. When he spoke, people listened. Not because he shouted. He never shouted. People listened because his words carried weight. Every sentence he spoke came from somewhere deep inside him, from a place of real thought and real feeling. Red Hawk's band was not large. They numbered about 300 people, men, women, children, and elders. They had set up their camp along a river that the Lakota called the Whispering Water, a name given because of the soft sound the river made as it moved over the smooth stones of its bed. It was a peaceful place. The cottonwood trees along the banks gave shade in the summer and shelter from the wind in the winter. The children played along the edges of the water. The women gathered roots and berries from the surrounding hills. The men hunted deer and elk in the nearby forests. Life was simple. Life was good. But everyone knew it could not last. Word had come from the south that soldiers were moving through the territory. 3 different bands of Lakota had already been forced onto reservations. Their horses had been taken. Their weapons had been confiscated. Their children had been sent to schools far away where they were forbidden to speak their own language. The stories that came back from those places were terrible. Families torn apart, people going hungry, proud men and women reduced to begging for food from the very people who had stolen everything from them. Red Hawk had listened to these stories with a heavy heart. He had sat in council with his advisors for many nights, discussing what to do. Some of the younger warriors wanted to fight. They said it was better to die as free men than to live as prisoners. Red Hawk understood their anger. He felt it himself, but he was also wise enough to see the bigger picture. The soldiers had guns that could fire many times without reloading. They had cannons. They had endless supplies of food and ammunition brought to them on trains that ran day and night. Fighting them head-on would mean death, not just for the warriors, but for the women and children, and elders too. And Red Hawk was not willing to sacrifice his people for the sake of pride. So he waited, he watched, he prayed, and he hoped that somehow, some way, there would be a path forward that did not end in blood. It was during this tense and uncertain time that Winona's story began. Winona was not born Lakota. She was a white woman. Her real name was Sarah Jennings, and she had come west with her husband Thomas in the spring of 1867. Thomas was a farmer from Ohio, a quiet man with big dreams of owning his own land in the new territories. Sarah had not wanted to come. She had a mother and two sisters back in Ohio, and she had been happy there. But Thomas was her husband, and in those days, a wife followed her husband. So she packed up her few belongings, said goodbye to her family, and climbed into the wagon that would carry them west. The journey had been long and hard. They traveled for months across flat, endless land. The sun burned during the day. The nights were cold. Sarah cooked over open fires and washed their clothes in streams. She did not complain. She was not the complaining type. She was a small woman, thin but strong, with light brown hair that she kept pinned under a bonnet and blue eyes that were always watching, always noticing things that others missed. She had a quiet strength about her, the kind that does not announce itself but reveals itself slowly, over time, in moments of crisis. They had settled on a piece of land about 40 miles east of the Whispering Water. Thomas built a small cabin from logs he cut himself. Sarah planted a garden. For a few months, things were good. Thomas cleared more land for farming. Sarah made the cabin feel like a home. She hung curtains she had sewn herself. She kept wildflowers in a tin cup on the table. She wrote letters to her mother that she knew might never arrive. But the land was not as empty as it appeared on the maps the government had given them. So the Lakota hunted in the forests nearby. Small groups of warriors sometimes passed within sight of the cabin. Thomas kept his rifle loaded and, leaning against the wall by the door, he told Sarah not to worry, that the soldiers at the nearest fort would protect them if anything happened. But Sarah could see the fear in his eyes when he said it, and she felt it in her own heart, too. The trouble came in the autumn of that year. A group of settlers about 10 miles to the south had gotten into a conflict with a small band of Lakota hunters. The details of what happened were confused and contradictory. The settlers said the Lakota had stolen their cattle. The Lakota said the settlers had built fences across a trail they had used for generations. Whatever the truth was, the result was violence. 2 settlers were killed. 1 Lakota warrior was shot and badly wounded. The soldiers at the fort responded by sending a patrol to punish the Lakota. They burned a small village, killed several people, and took a number of women and children as prisoners. The plains exploded with tension. Every settler in the region was terrified. Every Lakota band was furious. And caught in the middle of it all were people like Thomas and Sarah, ordinary people who had not asked for war and did not want it. Thomas decided they should leave. He told Sarah to pack what she could. They would go back east, back to Ohio, back to safety. Sarah agreed. She was afraid. She had heard the stories about what happened to settlers who were caught in the fighting, and she did not want to die in this lonely, beautiful, terrible place. But they waited one day too long. It happened on a cold morning in late October. The sky was gray and heavy with clouds. Thomas had gone out to the barn to harness their 2 horses to the wagon. Sarah was inside the cabin, packing the last of their food into a wooden crate. She heard the sound of hooves outside. Many hooves. She went to the window and looked out. There were riders coming across the open ground toward the cabin. A dozen of them, maybe more. They were Lakota. She could see the feathers in their hair, the painted designs on their horses. Her heart stopped. She could not breathe. She could not think. She just stood there at the window, frozen, watching them come. She heard Thomas shout something from the barn. Then she heard a gunshot. Then another. Then screaming. The screaming of horses. The shouting of men. She ran to the door and threw it open. What she saw outside made her legs go weak. Thomas was on the ground near the barn. He was not moving. His rifle was on the ground, beside him. 2 Lakota warriors were standing over him. She could see blood on the ground around him, dark against the brown earth. She opened her mouth to scream, but no sound came out. It was as if her voice had been stolen from her body. The warriors saw her. They turned toward her. She could see their faces now. They were young, barely more than boys. Their eyes were wild with the energy of what had just happened. One of them raised his weapon, a long lance with a stone point, and pointed it at her. She stood in the doorway of the cabin, her hands gripping the doorframe, her whole body shaking. She thought she was going to die, but she did not die. Not that day. An older warrior, a man with gray in his hair and scars on his arms, rode forward and spoke sharply to the young men. They lowered their weapons. The older warrior looked at Sarah for a long moment. Then he said something to the others. She did not understand the words, but she understood the tone. He was giving an order. The young men stepped back. The older warrior dismounted and walked toward her. She pressed herself against the doorframe, too afraid to move, too afraid to run. He stopped a few feet from her and looked at her. His face was not angry. It was not cruel. It was tired. He looked like a man who had seen too much and was weary of all of it. He pointed to the east, the direction she had come from. He was telling her to go, to leave, to run and never come back. She understood, but she could not leave Thomas. She looked past the warrior to where her husband lay on the ground. She took a step toward him. The warrior put his hand on her shoulder, gently but firmly, and shook his head. Thomas was gone. There was nothing she could do for him now. Sarah Jennings walked away from the cabin that day with nothing but the clothes on her back and a small leather pouch around her neck that contained a lock of her mother's hair and a folded letter from her sister. She walked east, into the gray morning, into the cold wind, into a world that had suddenly become larger and more terrifying than she had ever imagined. She walked for 2 days. She had no food. She had no water except what she could drink from small streams she crossed along the way. Her shoes wore through on the rough ground. Her feet bled. She was cold and hungry and exhausted, and more alone than she had ever been in her life. On the second night, she collapsed beside a fallen tree and lay there, too weak to go any further. She looked up at the sky. The clouds had cleared and the stars were out, thousands of them, more than she had ever seen back in Ohio. They were beautiful, heartbreakingly beautiful, and she lay there beneath them and cried. She cried for Thomas. She cried for the life they had planned together that would never happen now. She cried for her mother and her sisters who did not know she was alone and lost and dying on the open plains. She fell asleep crying. And when she woke up the next morning, she was not alone. There were people around her. Women. Lakota women. They were kneeling beside her, wrapping her in a buffalo robe, pressing a water skin to her lips. She tried to pull away, tried to get up, tried to run, but she was too weak. She could barely lift her head. One of the women, an older woman with kind eyes and deep wrinkles around her mouth, spoke to her in a soft voice. Sarah did not understand the words, but the tone was gentle. It was the tone her mother used when Sarah was a child and had fallen and scraped her knee. It was the tone of comfort, of care, of kindness. The women carried her to their camp. It was a small camp, just a few tipis set up in a sheltered valley near a stream. There were children there and old people, and dogs that barked at the newcomer. They laid Sarah down inside one of the tipis and covered her with blankets. They fed her broth made from dried meat. They cleaned her bleeding feet and wrapped them in soft leather. Sarah stayed in that camp for many days. She was too weak to travel, and even if she had been strong enough, she had nowhere to go. The nearest fort was at least 60 miles away. She would never make it on foot, not in her condition, not in the approaching winter. At first, she was afraid. Every sound made her jump. Every shadow made her heart race. She expected violence at any moment. She expected to be hurt or killed or worse. But nothing bad happened. The women treated her with quiet kindness. They brought her food. They sat with her and talked to her, even though she could not understand what they were saying. The children were curious about her. They would peek into the teepee and stare at her pale skin and her light hair with wide, fascinated eyes. Sometimes they would giggle and run away. Sometimes they would come closer and touch her hair, as if to see if it was real. Days turned into weeks. Sarah's strength returned slowly. She began to help the women with their work. She carried water from the stream. She gathered firewood. She helped scrape hides and prepare food. She was clumsy at first, unfamiliar with the tools and the techniques, but she learned quickly. She watched what the other women did and copied them. She did not complain. She did not ask for special treatment. She worked hard and did whatever was asked of her. The older woman who had first found her, whose name Sarah eventually learned was Tall Grass Woman, took a special interest in her. Tall Grass Woman was patient and kind. She taught Sarah words in the Lakota language, pointing to things and saying their names until Sarah could repeat them. Water, fire, sky, earth, food, sleep, thank you. Slowly, haltingly, Sarah began to learn. But she also became aware that not everyone in the camp was happy about her presence. Some of the men looked at her with suspicion and resentment. She was a white woman, a representative of the people who were taking their land, killing their buffalo, destroying their way of life. Her husband had been a settler, one of the many who had come uninvited to land that did not belong to them. Some of the warriors felt that keeping her was dangerous. If the soldiers found out that a white woman was living in their camp, it would give them an excuse to attack. There were arguments about what to do with her. Sarah could not understand the words, but she could read the body language and the tones of voice. She could see the anger on some faces and the compassion on others. She knew her fate was being debated, and she knew there was nothing she could do about it except wait. It was during one of these heated discussions that Sarah did something that would change everything. Something that no one expected. Something that would set in motion a chain of events leading all the way to Red Hawk himself. The argument had been going on for a long time. The men were sitting in a circle around a fire, speaking loudly and sometimes angrily. The women watched from the edges of the camp, their faces tight with worry. Sarah watched too, standing near the teepee where she slept, her arms wrapped around herself against the cold. She did not fully understand what was being said, but she understood enough. She had learned enough words by now to catch fragments. She heard the word for danger. She heard the word for soldiers. She heard the word for send away, and she understood that they were talking about her. Something moved inside her, not fear. She was beyond fear now. She had lost everything. Her husband, her home, her old life. She had nothing left to lose. What moved inside her was something else. It was a feeling she had never experienced before. It was humility, true humility. Not the kind that comes from weakness or defeat, but the kind that comes from understanding. She understood, perhaps for the first time in her life, that she was a guest in someone else's world. She understood that these people owed her nothing. They had saved her life. They had fed her and clothed her and sheltered her. They had done this despite the fact that her people were their enemies. They had shown her kindness that she had no right to expect. And she understood that she could not just stand there and let them argue about her as if she were a problem to be solved. She walked forward. The men stopped talking and looked at her. The women gasped. Children peeked out from behind their mothers. Everyone watched as this small, thin, pale woman walked into the circle of men and stood there, looking at each of them in turn. Then she did something that shocked everyone. She knelt down. She lowered her head. She placed her hands flat on the cold ground in front of her, and in the broken, halting Lakota she had learned from Tall Grass Woman, she spoke. She said she was grateful. She said she knew she did not belong here. She said she understood their fear and their anger. She said she did not want to bring trouble to their camp. She said she would leave if they wanted her to leave. She would walk into the snow and the cold and take her chances alone, but she wanted them to know that she was grateful for the food, for the warmth, for the kindness, for everything. She offered herself humbly, not with words of demand or negotiation, not with threats or promises. She simply knelt on the frozen ground and offered the only thing she had left: her gratitude, her honesty, her humility. The camp was silent. No one moved. No one spoke. The fire crackled and popped. The wind blew across the open plain and made the teepee covers flutter, and somewhere many miles to the north, along the banks of the whispering water, Red Hawk was about to hear about this woman. And when he did, his life and hers would become woven together in a way that neither of them could have imagined. The news of the white woman who knelt traveled faster than any horse could carry it. Among the Lakota, stories moved like wind across the plains, from one camp to another, told and retold around evening fires, gaining shape and meaning with each telling. Within days, people who had never seen Sarah Jennings knew about her. They knew about the way she had walked into the circle of men without being invited. They knew about the way she had lowered herself to the ground and pressed her hands into the frozen earth. They knew about the words she had spoken in their own language, simple and broken, but real, and they talked about it. Some said she was clever. They said she had done it to save herself, that it was a trick, the kind of thing white people did when they wanted something. They smiled and shook their heads and said this woman was no different from the rest of her kind. Give her a chance and she would betray them just like all the others had. Some said she was foolish. A white woman kneeling before Lakota warriors was either very brave or very stupid, and they could not decide which. But others said something different. Others said they had never seen anything like it. Not from a white person. Not ever. The white people they had encountered came with guns and demands and pieces of paper covered in words they could not read. The white people took what they wanted and gave nothing in return. They did not kneel. They did not bow their heads. They did not offer gratitude. This woman had done all of those things, and that meant something. The story reached Red Hawk on a cold evening in early November. A young rider named Quick Fox had traveled from the southern camp to bring news and trade goods. He sat by Red Hawk's fire, drinking hot broth and warming his hands, and he told the chief everything he had heard. Red Hawk listened without interrupting. That was his way. He never spoke while someone else was speaking. He believed that listening was the first duty of a leader. When Quick Fox finished, Red Hawk sat quietly for a long time, staring into the fire. The flames danced and threw shadows across his face. His advisors, who had gathered to hear the news, waited for him to speak. Finally, he asked one question. He asked what the woman's eyes looked like when she knelt. Quick Fox was confused by the question. He had not been there himself. He was only repeating what others had told him. He said he did not know about her eyes. Red Hawk nodded slowly. He said that a person's eyes tell you everything. Words can be false. Actions can be practiced. But eyes do not lie. He said he wanted to see this woman for himself. He wanted to look into her eyes and know whether what she had done came from her heart or from her fear. His advisors were uneasy. Some of them argued against it. They said bringing a white woman to their camp would attract attention from the soldiers. They said it was too dangerous. A Jalificus One advisor, an old warrior named Stoneface, said that the kindest thing to do would be to give the woman a horse and some food and send her toward the nearest fort. Let her own people take care of her. She was not their responsibility. Red Hawk listened to all of them. He respected their opinions. But in the end, he made his own decision. He said he would ride south and see this woman. He said he would look into her eyes, and then he would decide. No one argued further. When Red Hawk made a decision, it was final. Not because he was a tyrant. He was anything but. It was because his people trusted his judgment. He had earned that trust over many years, through countless decisions that had kept them safe, and fed, and free. Red Hawk rode south with 3 companions. They traveled for 2 days across the open plain, through freezing wind and occasional snow. The land stretched out around them in every direction, brown and gray and endless. The sky was enormous above them, pale and cold. They passed herds of buffalo in the distance, dark shapes moving slowly across the frozen grass. They passed the remains of old camps, circles of stones where fires had once burned. They crossed frozen streams and rode through valleys where the wind could not reach them, and the silence was so deep it felt like something alive. On the evening of the second day, they reached the camp where Sarah was living. It was a small camp, just as Quick Fox had described, a handful of teepees arranged in a loose circle near a stream. Smoke rose from the tops of the teepees and hung in the still, cold air. Dogs barked as the riders approached. Children ran out to see who was coming and then ran back inside when they saw the unfamiliar faces. The camp's leader, a man named Broken Arrow, came out to greet Red Hawk. The 2 men knew each other. They had met at gatherings and ceremonies over the years. They embraced and spoke quietly for a few minutes. Then Broken Arrow led Red Hawk and his companions to his own teepee, where food and warm blankets were waiting. They ate together and talked about the things that concerned all the Lakota bands in the region. The movements of the soldiers, the dwindling buffalo herds, the pressure to sign treaties and move to reservations. It was a conversation they had all had many times before, and the weight of it showed on every face around the fire. After a while, Red Hawk brought up the subject of the white woman. Broken Arrow's face changed when the subject was raised. He looked tired. He said the woman had caused division in his camp. Some people wanted her to stay. Others wanted her gone. He said she worked hard and caused no trouble, but her presence was like a stone in a moccasin. It rubbed and irritated and could not be ignored. Red Hawk asked to see her. Broken Arrow sent one of the women to fetch Sarah. A few minutes later, she appeared at the entrance of the teepee. She stood there, hesitant, uncertain, her hands clasped in front of her. She was wearing Lakota clothing now, a deerskin dress and leggings and moccasins that the women had given her. Her light brown hair hung loose around her shoulders. She looked thin and pale, but there was something in the way she held herself that caught Red Hawk's attention. She was not cowering. She was not trembling. She stood straight and still, like a person who has decided to face whatever comes without flinching. Red Hawk looked at her. He looked at her for a long time. He studied her face. He studied her posture. He studied the way her hands were clasped, not in prayer but in readiness. And then he looked into her eyes. What he saw there surprised him. He had expected fear. He had expected the desperate, calculating look of a person trying to survive. But that was not what he saw. What he saw in Sarah Jennings' eyes was something he recognized. It was grief. Deep, heavy, bone-level grief. The kind that does not go away. The kind that changes a person permanently, like a river that carves a new path through stone. She had lost everything. And that loss had burned away everything that was false in her and left only what was real. Red Hawk saw something else too. He saw acceptance. Not the weak kind of acceptance that comes from giving up. The strong kind. The kind that comes from looking at the truth of your situation, no matter how terrible it is, and saying, yes, this is where I am. This is what has happened. And I will go forward from here. He spoke to her in Lakota, slowly and clearly, knowing she might understand some of what he said. He asked her why she had knelt. Sarah struggled with the words. Her Lakota was still rough and limited, but she understood the question and she tried to answer it. She said in her broken way that she knelt because it was the right thing to do. She said these people had saved her life, she said, kneeling was the only way she knew to show respect when she had nothing else to give. Red Hawk was quiet for a moment after she spoke. Then he turned to Broken Arrow and said something that made every person in the teepee fall silent. He said he would take the woman to his own camp. The reaction was immediate. Broken Arrow looked relieved but also worried. Red Hawk's companions exchanged glances. One of them, a young warrior named Running Cloud, opened his mouth to protest but thought better of it when he saw the look on Red Hawk's face. Red Hawk explained his reasoning. He said the woman was a problem here because this camp was small and divided. In his camp, which was larger and more established, she could be absorbed more easily. He said he was not doing this out of charity. He said he was doing it because he believed this woman might be useful. The soldiers and the government agents were always looking for excuses to attack the Lakota. If they could show that a white woman had been treated well, had been protected and cared for, it might make the soldiers pause. It might give them a reason to talk instead of fight. It was a practical argument, and his advisors accepted it. But those who knew Red Hawk well suspected there was more to his decision than strategy. Red Hawk was a man who paid attention to signs. He believed that the Great Spirit placed people and events in your path for a reason. And something about this woman, something about her grief and her humility and the steady look in her blue eyes had spoken to him. They left the next morning. Sarah rode on a horse that Broken Arrow gave her, bundled in buffalo robes against the cold. She did not know where they were taking her. She did not know who Red Hawk was or what he intended. She only knew that this tall, quiet man with the deep lines on his face had looked at her and decided she should come with him. And she went. Not because she had no choice. She could have refused. She could have asked to be taken to the fort. But something in Red Hawk's manner, something in the way he had looked at her, made her trust him. It was not a logical trust. It was deeper than that. It was the kind of trust that comes from one wounded soul recognizing another. The journey north took 3 days. They traveled slowly because of the cold and because Red Hawk was careful. He sent scouts ahead to watch for soldiers. He chose routes that followed valleys and riverbeds, where they would be hidden from anyone watching from a distance. He stopped frequently to let the horses rest and to check that Sarah was warm enough and had enough to eat. On the second night, they made camp in a protected hollow beneath a low bluff. The wind howled above them but could not reach them in their shelter. They built a small fire and sat around it, eating dried meat and drinking water from a skin bag. Sarah sat slightly apart from the others, as she always did. She was still unsure of her place. She was still afraid of saying or doing the wrong thing. Red Hawk noticed her sitting alone. He stood and walked over to her and sat down beside her. For a while, he said nothing. He just sat there, looking at the fire. Then he began to talk. Not to her specifically. He talked as if he were talking to the fire, or to the sky, or to no one at all. He talked about his life, about his childhood, about his father who had been a chief before him, about his wife who had died of a white man's disease 3 years earlier, about his 2 sons, one of whom had been killed by soldiers the previous summer. Sarah understood only fragments of what he said, but she understood enough. She understood that this man knew grief too, that he carried it with him every day, just as she did, that it sat on his shoulders like a weight that never lifted. And she understood something else, something important. She understood that he was sharing this with her not because she had asked, but because he wanted her to know that she was not alone in her pain. When he finished talking, he looked at her and said something she did understand. He said it slowly and clearly so she could follow the words. He said that in his camp, she would be safe. He said that no one would harm her. He said that she would be expected to work because everyone in the camp worked. But she would be treated fairly. She would be fed and clothed and sheltered. And if the time came when she wanted to leave, she would be free to go. Sarah felt tears rising in her eyes. She blinked them back. She did not want to cry in front of this man. She did not want him to think she was weak. But the tears came anyway, slipping down her cold cheeks before she could stop them. She whispered the Lakota word for thank you, the word tall grass woman had taught her. She said it over and over again, her voice barely audible above the wind. Red Hawk simply nodded. Then he stood up and went back to the fire. They arrived at Red Hawk's camp on the afternoon of the 3rd day. Sarah saw it from a distance, a collection of tipis spread along the banks of the Whispering Water. Even from far away, she could tell this was a larger and more established camp than the one she had come from. There were many tipis, some of them decorated with painted figures and symbols. There were racks of drying meat and wooden frames where hides were being stretched. There were horses grazing on the banks of the river and children running and playing on the open ground between the teepees. The camp's reaction to her arrival was mixed. Some people came out to look at her with curiosity. Others turned away and went back to their work. A few men stood in small groups talking quietly and watching her with hard, suspicious eyes. She could feel the weight of their stares as she rode through the camp. She kept her head down and said nothing. Red Hawk dismounted and spoke to several people, explaining the situation. She could see the surprise on their faces and the resistance in some of them, but no one openly challenged him. Whatever disagreements they had, they would express them later, in council, in the proper way. Red Hawk assigned Sarah to the teepee of a woman named Morningstar. Morningstar was about Sarah's age, maybe 30, with a round face and strong hands and a manner that was brisk but not unkind. She had lost her own husband in a fight with soldiers the year before and was raising 2 small children alone. She needed help with the daily work, and Red Hawk thought Sarah could provide that help. Morningstar looked Sarah up and down when they were introduced. She did not smile. She did not welcome her. She simply pointed to a spot inside the teepee where Sarah could sleep, and then handed her a water skin and pointed toward the river. The message was clear. No speeches, no ceremonies, just work. Sarah took the water skin and went to the river. She knelt on the bank and dipped the skin into the cold, clear water. She could see her own reflection in the surface, a thin, pale face surrounded by wild hair, wearing clothes that were not her own, living a life that was not her own, in a world she did not understand. She stared at that reflection for a long time, and then she lifted the filled water skin, stood up, and walked back to the teepee. Over the following weeks, Sarah settled into the rhythm of the camp. The work was hard. She hauled water from the river. She gathered firewood from the surrounding hills, sometimes walking for miles to find dry wood in the snow. She helped Morningstar scrape and prepare hides, a process that left her hands raw and aching. She learned to cook in the Lakota way, making stews from dried meat and roots, baking bread from ground corn on hot stones. She tended the fire through the long, cold nights, keeping it alive so that Morningstar's children would stay warm. The physical labor was exhausting, but Sarah did not mind it. In fact, she welcomed it. The work kept her mind occupied. It kept her from thinking too much about Thomas, about the cabin, about the life she had lost. When she was hauling water, or chopping wood, or scraping hides, she was too tired to grieve, and that was a mercy. She continued to learn the Lakota language. Morningstar was not a patient teacher like Tall Grass Woman had been. She spoke quickly and did not repeat herself, but she was consistent. She talked constantly while they worked, naming things, describing what she was doing, telling stories about her children, complaining about the cold. Sarah absorbed the words like a sponge. She made mistakes and Morningstar corrected her sharply. But she learned fast. Within a month, she could carry on a basic conversation. Within 2 months, she could follow most of what was said around her. And the more she understood, the more she saw. She saw a community that was struggling but holding together. She saw women who worked from before dawn until after dark, keeping their families fed and warm and healthy. She saw children who were curious and playful and bright despite the uncertainty that hung over their lives. She saw old men and women who carried the wisdom of generations in their memories and shared it freely with anyone who would listen. And she saw warriors who were brave and proud, but also worried, men who knew that the world they had grown up in was disappearing and who did not know how to stop it. She also saw Red Hawk. He moved through the camp like a quiet force, checking on families, settling disputes, making decisions. He did not sit in one place and give orders. He walked. He visited every teepee. He asked about sick children and injured horses and food supplies. He talked to the elders and listened to the young men. He was everywhere and nowhere, always present but never imposing. Sometimes he stopped by Morningstar's teepee to check on Sarah. He would ask how she was, whether she needed anything, whether anyone had bothered her. She always said she was fine. She always thanked him, and he always nodded and moved on. Their conversations were brief, but they carried a weight that was out of proportion to the words spoken. There was an understanding between them, an unspoken recognition that they were connected by something deeper than circumstance. But Sarah was also becoming aware of a growing danger. The soldiers were getting closer. Scouts reported that a large force was moving through the territory, searching for Lakota camps that had refused to go to the reservations. Red Hawk's camp was one of them. The soldiers had maps and guides and plenty of men. It was only a matter of time before they found the whispering water. Red Hawk called a council. The men gathered in the large council teepee and talked for hours. Sarah could hear the raised voices from where she sat in Morningstar's teepee. Morningstar sat with her children, her face tight with worry, her eyes fixed on the council teepee. The children sensed their mother's fear and were quiet, pressing close to her, their small faces serious and still. The council went on late into the night. When it finally ended, the men emerged looking grim. Morningstar went to talk to one of the warriors and came back looking pale. She told Sarah that the soldiers were 3 days away, maybe less if they moved fast. The council had debated whether to fight or to move. Some wanted to fight. Some wanted to flee deeper into the hills. Red Hawk had argued for neither. He had proposed something else, something that stunned everyone. Red Hawk had proposed to meet the soldiers and negotiate. He wanted to talk. He wanted to find a way to avoid bloodshed, and he wanted to bring Sarah with him. Morningstar looked at Sarah when she said this. Her face was unreadable. She did not say whether she thought this was a good idea or a bad one. She simply told Sarah the facts and let her react. Sarah sat very still for a long time after Morningstar finished speaking. The fire crackled. The children slept outside. The wind moved through the cottonwood trees along the river and made them whisper. She was afraid. Of course she was afraid. The idea of walking up to a column of armed soldiers, standing beside a Lakota chief and trying to negotiate peace was terrifying. She was nobody. She was a farmer's wife from Ohio who had lost everything. She had no authority, no power, no standing. What could she possibly say that would make any difference? But then she thought about Red Hawk. She thought about the night he had sat beside her and told her about his wife and his sons. She thought about the way he had looked at her in Broken Arrow's teepee, studying her eyes. She thought about the promise he had made to her that she would be safe, and she realized something. He had kept his promise. He had protected her. He had given her a place in his world when her own world had fallen apart. Now he was asking her for something. He had not demanded it. He had not ordered it. He had proposed it to the council and was leaving it to her to decide. Sarah knew what her answer would be. She had known it from the moment Morningstar told her she would go with Red Hawk. She would stand beside him. She would speak to the soldiers. She would do whatever she could to help. Not because she was brave, not because she was heroic, but because it was the right thing to do. Because these people had saved her life and shown her kindness, and she owed them a debt that she could never fully repay. And because in some way she could not fully explain, she believed in Red Hawk. She believed in the steadiness of his voice and the depth of his eyes and the quiet strength of his spirit. She told Morningstar that she would go. Morningstar looked at her for a long moment. Then, for the first time since Sarah had arrived, Morningstar smiled. It was a small smile, barely there, but it was real. She reached out and touched Sarah's hand. And that single touch said more than 1,000 words could have said. The camp began to prepare. Not for war, for something harder than war, for hope. Red Hawk gathered a small group. He chose his companions carefully. He took 3 warriors, older men who were known for their calm and their wisdom. He took 2 women elders who carried the authority of their years and their experience. And he took Sarah. 7 people in all. 7 against an army. Before they left, Red Hawk stood before the camp and spoke. He told his people that he did not know what would happen. He said he hoped for peace, but he prepared for the worst. He told the families to pack their things and be ready to move quickly if the negotiation failed. He told the warriors to be alert but to keep their weapons hidden. He did not want anything to provoke the soldiers. Then he turned to Sarah. The whole camp was watching. 300 pairs of eyes fixed on this unlikely pair, the Lakota chief and the white woman who had knelt in the snow. Red Hawk spoke directly to her. He said that what they were about to do was dangerous. He said that the soldiers might not listen. They might not care that she was there, they might arrest her, or worse. He wanted her to know the risks. He wanted her to have every chance to change her mind. Sarah listened. She understood every word. Her Lakota had improved enough for that. And when he finished, she answered him in his own language. She said she understood the danger. She said she was not changing her mind. She said she would walk beside him and speak the truth, and hope that the truth was enough. Red Hawk looked at her, and for the first time she saw something in his eyes that she had not seen before. It was not gratitude exactly. It was recognition, the recognition of an equal, a partner, someone who understood what was at stake and was willing to face it. He nodded. Then he turned and mounted his horse. Sarah mounted hers. The small group rode out of the camp in the pale morning light, heading south toward the approaching soldiers. Behind them, the camp fell silent. The women held their children close. The warriors checked their weapons, and everyone prayed. The plain stretched out before them, cold and vast and indifferent. Somewhere ahead, the soldiers were coming, and Red Hawk and Sarah rode toward them, side by side into whatever waited. They rode south for a full day. The land around them was silent except for the wind and the steady rhythm of hooves on frozen ground. No one spoke much. The 3 warriors who rode with them kept their eyes on the horizon, scanning for movement, watching for dust clouds that would signal the approach of mounted soldiers. The 2 elder women rode close together, their faces calm but their hands tight on their reins. Sarah rode beside Red Hawk, slightly behind him, matching his pace. She had never been more aware of the world around her than she was that day. Every detail seemed sharp and vivid and important. The way the dry grass bent in the wind, the way the pale winter sun hung low on the horizon, casting long shadows that stretched out behind them like dark fingers pointing back toward the camp they had left. The way Red Hawk's breath formed small white clouds in the cold air, the way the leather of her saddle creaked with every step of the horse beneath her. She wanted to remember all of it. She felt, in some deep and wordless way, that this might be the last day of her life, and she wanted to see it clearly. Red Hawk seemed calm. He rode with his back straight and his head up, looking ahead. But Sarah had learned to read him by now. She could see the tension in his jaw. She could see the way his hands gripped the reins just a little too tightly. He was not calm. He was choosing to appear calm. And that, she realized, was what leadership looked like. Not the absence of fear, but the decision to carry that fear quietly so that others would not be crushed by it. They made camp that night on a low rise that gave them a good view of the surrounding plains. They built no fire. Red Hawk did not want to announce their presence. They ate cold, dried meat and drank water and sat close together for warmth. In the darkness, Red Hawk spoke to the group. He laid out his plan, he said. They would continue south in the morning until they found the soldiers. He said he would ride ahead with a white flag, a piece of cloth tied to a long pole, which was the universal signal for a desire to talk. He said Sarah would ride beside him. The sight of a white woman riding freely with a Lakota chief would confuse the soldiers. It would make them curious. And curiosity was better than aggression. Curious men ask questions. Aggressive men shoot first, he said. The warriors and the elder women would stay behind at a safe distance if anything went wrong. If the soldiers attacked instead of talking, the warriors were to ride back to camp immediately and warn the people to move. They were not to fight. They were not to try to rescue Red Hawk or Sarah. The survival of the camp was more important than any individual life, including his own. The warriors did not like this order. Running Cloud, the youngest of them, said that a chief should not ride unprotected toward armed soldiers. He said it was too dangerous. He said that if Red Hawk was killed, the camp would lose its leader. He begged Red Hawk to let the warriors ride with him. Red Hawk listened. Then he shook his head. He said that riding toward soldiers with armed warriors would look like an attack. It would provoke exactly the response they were trying to avoid. He needed to approach from a position of vulnerability, not strength. He needed the soldiers to see that he was not a threat. He needed them to see a man who came to talk, not to fight. Running Cloud fell silent. He did not agree, but he obeyed. That was the way things worked with Red Hawk. You could disagree with him freely. You could argue with him passionately. But once he made his decision, you followed it, because you knew he had thought about it more deeply than you had. Sarah lay awake most of that night. She stared up at the stars and tried to imagine what the next day would bring. She thought about what she would say to the soldiers. She rehearsed words in her head, English words that she had not spoken in months. She realized with a strange, distant shock that her own language felt unfamiliar to her now. The shapes of English words felt awkward in her mouth, like stones that did not fit together properly. She had been living in Lakota for so long that the rhythms and sounds of that language had become more natural to her than the language she had been born speaking. She thought about Thomas. She thought about the morning he had been killed, and the terrible blankness of those first hours afterward. She thought about the long walk east, the hunger and the cold, the moment she had collapsed beside the fallen tree. She thought about Tall Grass Woman kneeling beside her with the water skin. She thought about Morningstar handing her the empty water bag and pointing toward the river without a word. She thought about the children peeking into the teepee and giggling at her pale skin. She thought about all the small acts of kindness that had kept her alive and brought her to this moment. And she thought about Red Hawk. She thought about the first time he had looked into her eyes. She thought about the night he had sat beside her and told her about his dead wife and his dead son. She thought about the way he moved through his camp, quiet and watchful, carrying the weight of 300 lives on his broad shoulders. She thought about the way he had asked her to come with him on this journey, not as a tool or a weapon or a bargaining chip, but as a partner, as someone he trusted. She closed her eyes and tried to sleep. Sleep did not come easily, but it came eventually. Shallow and restless, filled with fragments of dreams she could not hold on to. Dawn arrived cold and gray. The sky was overcast, heavy clouds sitting low on the horizon like a gray ceiling pressing down on the earth. The group ate quickly, silently, and mounted their horses. They rode south. An hour passed, then two. The land around them was flat and featureless, brown grass stretching to the horizon in every direction. Sarah's heart beat faster with every mile. Her mouth was dry. Her hands were sweating inside her gloves. Then Running Cloud, who had ridden slightly ahead as a scout, came galloping back. He pulled his horse to a stop in front of Red Hawk and pointed south. Soldiers. He had seen them. A large column, maybe 100 men, moving north along a wide trail. They were less than 3 miles away. The group stopped. Red Hawk sat on his horse for a moment, looking south. Then he turned to the warriors and the elder women and repeated his instructions. Stay here. Watch. If things go wrong, ride back to camp. Do not fight. Then he turned to Sarah. He looked at her with those deep, steady eyes. He did not ask if she was ready. He did not ask if she was afraid. He simply looked at her, and in that look was everything. Trust, respect, and something that might have been gratitude, though he would never have called it that. He picked up the long pole with the white cloth tied to it. He held it high. Then he turned his horse south and began to ride. Sarah rode beside him. They covered the distance quickly. The flat ground allowed them to see the soldiers from far away, and the soldiers could see them too. Sarah watched as the column slowed and then stopped. She could see men pointing. She could see officers raising spyglasses to their eyes. She could imagine the confusion they must be feeling. 2 riders approaching from the north, one of them clearly a native man, the other apparently a white woman. It was not what they had expected to find. Red Hawk kept his pace steady. He did not hurry. He did not slow down. He rode with the white flag held high above his head, the cloth snapping in the cold wind. Sarah stayed beside him, close enough to reach out and touch his horse if she had wanted to. Her eyes were fixed on the soldiers ahead. She could make out individual men now. She could see their blue coats and their rifles. She could see the shapes of cannons being pulled by teams of horses. Her stomach churned with fear. When they were about 200 yards from the column, a group of riders broke away and came toward them at a trot. 4 soldiers, led by an officer on a tall bay horse. The officer had a thick mustache and a weathered face and wore a long blue coat with gold buttons. He carried a pistol on his hip, but had not drawn it. His men had their rifles resting across their saddles, ready but not aimed. Red Hawk stopped his horse. Sarah stopped hers. The soldiers pulled up about 20 yards away. For a moment, no one moved. No one spoke. The 2 groups faced each other across that short distance, and the weight of everything that had happened, and everything that was about to happen, hung in the air between them like smoke. The officer was the first to speak. He addressed Sarah, not Red Hawk. He spoke in English, and hearing her own language after so long was like a physical blow. The words hit her ears, and her brain scrambled to process them. He asked who she was. He asked what she was doing out here with a hostile. Sarah opened her mouth to speak, and for a terrible moment, nothing came out. Her English was buried under months of Lakota. The words she needed were there, somewhere in the back of her mind, but they would not come forward. She swallowed hard. She clenched her fists. She forced herself to think in English, to form the sentences in the language she had been born into. She said her name was Sarah Jennings. She said she was from Ohio. She said her husband, Thomas Jennings, had been killed the previous autumn. She said the Lakota people had saved her life. They had taken her in when she was alone and starving and had no one to help her. They had fed her and clothed her and treated her with kindness. The officer's eyebrows rose. He looked at Red Hawk with new interest. He asked Sarah if she was a prisoner. He asked if she was being held against her will. He asked if she needed to be rescued. Sarah felt a surge of emotion so strong that it nearly knocked her off her horse. Rescued. That was the word he used. As if these people, the people who had saved her life and given her a home and treated her like a human being, were her captors. As if she needed saving from the only people who had bothered to save her. She kept her voice steady. She said no. She was not a prisoner. She was not being held against her will. She was here because she chose to be. She was here because Chief Red Hawk had asked her to come, and she had agreed. She was here because Red Hawk wanted to talk, not fight. He wanted to find a way to live in peace. He wanted to keep his people safe, just as the officer wanted to keep his soldiers safe. He did not want war. None of them wanted war. The officer studied her face for a long time. Sarah could see doubt in his eyes. He was not sure whether to believe her. He had been told stories about captured settlers, about women who were brainwashed or threatened into defending their captors. He was trying to decide if that was what was happening here. Then Red Hawk spoke. He spoke in Lakota, slowly and clearly, and Sarah translated his words into English as he spoke. It was the first time she had ever served as a bridge between the two languages, the two worlds, and it felt both natural and impossible at the same time. The words flowed through her, Lakota in one ear and English out of her mouth, as if she were a river connecting two separate lands. Red Hawk said that he was the chief of the Lakota band that lived along the river to the north. He said his people were peaceful, they hunted buffalo and raised their children, and wanted nothing more than to live their lives in the way their ancestors had lived theirs. He said he had come to talk because he believed talking was better than fighting. He said he did not pretend to have power. He did not pretend to have the weapons or the numbers that the soldiers had. He was one man with one woman and a white flag. He had come in good faith. The officer listened to the translation with a guarded expression. When Red Hawk finished, the officer was quiet for a moment. Then he said that his orders were to bring all remaining Lakota bands in the territory to the reservation. He said those were his orders and he intended to follow them. He said he did not want violence either, but his instructions were clear. Sarah translated the officer's words to Red Hawk. She watched his face as he listened. She saw the pain that crossed his features, quick and sharp like a blade cutting flesh. But he did not let it linger. He composed himself and spoke again. He said he understood the officer's position. He said he was willing to negotiate. He asked if there was a way to avoid the reservation, perhaps an agreement that would allow his people to remain on their land in exchange for certain concessions. He asked if the officer had the authority to discuss such things. The officer said he did not have that authority. He said that decision would have to come from higher up, from the commanders back at the fort, or perhaps from Washington itself. He said the best he could do was send a message to his superiors and request that a formal negotiation be arranged. But he could not guarantee anything, and in the meantime his orders stood. There was a silence. Sarah felt the fragility of the moment. It was like standing on thin ice. One wrong word, one sudden movement, and everything would shatter. Then Red Hawk did something unexpected. He dismounted from his horse. He walked forward, on foot, toward the mounted soldiers. Sarah's heart leaped into her throat. What was he doing? The soldiers tensed. The men behind the officer raised their rifles slightly. The officer put his hand on his pistol, but Red Hawk did not stop. He walked until he was standing directly in front of the officer's horse. He looked up at the man. Then he reached up and removed a necklace from around his own neck. It was a beautiful thing, made of eagle feathers and beads and a single polished stone that caught the gray light. He held it up to the officer. He said, through Sarah, who had dismounted and followed him forward, that this necklace had belonged to his father and to his grandfather before that. It was the most valuable thing he owned. He was giving it to the officer as a sign of his sincerity. He wanted the officer to take it back to his commanders and show them that Red Hawk had come in peace. He wanted them to know that the Lakota chief had given up something precious in the name of dialogue. He asked only that the soldiers wait before marching on his camp, wait until there could be a proper discussion, wait before anyone else had to die. The officer looked at the necklace. He looked at Red Hawk. He looked at Sarah. Something shifted in his face. It was subtle, barely visible, but Sarah saw it. A crack in the armor, a moment of doubt in the certainty of his orders. He reached down and took the necklace. He said he would send a rider to the fort with Red Hawk's request. He said he would wait 3 days for a response. 3 days. That was all he could promise. If no response came, or if the response was negative, he would have to carry out his orders. Red Hawk nodded. 3 days. It was not much, but it was something. It was a crack in the wall, a sliver of light in the darkness. They parted. The soldiers turned and rode back to their column. Red Hawk and Sarah mounted their horses and rode north, back toward the warriors and the elder women who were waiting on the rise. No one spoke during the ride back. The weight of what had just happened was too great for words. When they reached the others, Running Cloud was the first to speak. He asked what had happened. Red Hawk told them everything. The warriors listened in silence. When Red Hawk finished, the elder women nodded slowly. One of them, A woman named Crowfeather, who was the oldest person in the camp, said that Red Hawk had done a brave thing. She said his father would have been proud. Red Hawk said nothing. He turned his horse north and began the long ride back to camp. The next 3 days were the longest of Sarah's life. The camp buzzed with tension. Families packed their belongings. Warriors sharpened their weapons and prepared their horses. Scouts rode out in every direction, watching for soldiers, watching for any sign of movement on the plains. Children picked up on the anxiety of the adults and became quiet and clingy. Even the dogs seemed restless, pacing and whining. Red Hawk moved through the camp as he always did, calm and steady, checking on everyone, offering reassurance. But Sarah could see the strain beneath his composure. His eyes were tired. His movements were slower than usual. He was carrying the weight of his people's future on his shoulders, and it was crushing him. Sarah tried to help in whatever way she could. She worked alongside Morningstar, hauling water, preparing food, packing supplies. She helped the elder women roll up hides and take down tippies that were ready to move. She told the children stories in Lakota, stumbling over words, making them laugh despite the fear that surrounded them. On the evening of the second day, Red Hawk came to Morningstar's teepee. He asked to speak with Sarah alone. Morningstar took her children and went to visit a neighbor. Red Hawk sat across the fire from Sarah. He was silent for a long time. Then he told her something he had not told anyone else. He told her that he was afraid, not for himself. He said he had made peace with the idea of his own death long ago. He was afraid for his people, for the children, for the elders who could not run and could not fight. He was afraid that his gamble with the soldiers had been a mistake. He was afraid that the officer would not keep his word. He was afraid that in 3 days the soldiers would come and everything would be lost. Sarah listened. She did not try to comfort him with empty words. She did not tell him everything would be all right, because she did not know that. Instead, she did something that surprised even herself. She reached across the fire and took his hand. His hand was large and rough and warm. She held it in both of hers and looked into his eyes. She said, in Lakota, that whatever happened, he had done the right thing. She said that trying for peace was never a mistake, even if peace did not come. She said that his people were lucky to have him. She said that she was lucky to have him, and she meant it. She meant every word of it, with every part of herself. Red Hawk looked at their hands, hers small and pale, his large and dark, joined together across the fire. He did not pull away. He did not speak. He just looked at their hands and at the fire, and at the smoke rising through the opening at the top of the tipi into the dark sky above. The third day arrived. By midday, the scouts reported movement to the south. Soldiers, but not the full column. A small group. 3 riders carrying a white flag. The camp held its breath. Red Hawk rode out to meet them. Sarah rode beside him. The warriors followed at a distance. The 3 soldiers stopped and waited. The lead rider was not the officer from before. He was a different man, younger, with a clean-shaven face and nervous eyes. He carried a leather pouch. He dismounted and saluted. He said he had a message from the fort commander. He handed the leather pouch to Sarah, who opened it with trembling hands. Inside was a letter. Sarah read it aloud, translating each line into Lakota for Red Hawk and the others to hear. The letter said that the fort commander, a colonel named James Mitchell, had received Red Hawk's request and the eagle feather necklace. The letter said that Colonel Mitchell was willing to meet with Red Hawk to discuss terms. It said that a temporary ceasefire would be in effect for the next 30 days while negotiations took place. It said that Red Hawk's band would not be forcibly removed during this period. It said that a meeting would be arranged at the fort in 1 week's time, and that Red Hawk was invited to bring his advisors and the woman named Sarah Jennings. Sarah's voice broke as she read the last lines. She had to stop and take a breath before she could finish. When she did finish, she looked at Red Hawk. His face was still. His eyes were shining. He did not smile. Red Hawk was not a man who smiled easily, but there was something in his expression that she had never seen before. It was hope, fragile, uncertain, but real, like the first green shoot that pushes through the snow at the end of a long winter. He turned to the young soldier and spoke through Sarah. He thanked the colonel for his willingness to talk. He said he would be at the fort in 1 week. He said he would bring his advisors and the woman. He said he came in peace and in good faith. The young soldier saluted again, mounted his horse, and rode south with his companions. Red Hawk sat on his horse for a long time after the soldiers left. He looked south, toward the fort, toward the future, toward whatever was coming. Then he turned north, toward his camp, toward his people, toward the 300 lives that depended on him. And as they rode back toward the whispering water, as the camp came into view and the people emerged from their teepees and stood watching, waiting, hoping, Red Hawk turned to Sarah. He looked at her the way he had looked at her that first day in Broken Arrow's teepee. He looked into her eyes, and he saw what he had seen then and so much more. He saw the farm girl from Ohio who had lost everything. He saw the woman who had knelt on the frozen ground and offered herself humbly. He saw the translator, the bridge, the connection between two worlds that had no other way to speak to each other. He saw a partner. He saw a friend, he said to her, in a voice so quiet that only she could hear, that when they reached the camp, he wanted her to stay behind him. He said the people would rush forward. They would want to know what happened. They would be emotional, frightened, hopeful, desperate for news. He said it would be overwhelming. He said she should stay behind him and let him speak first. He would tell them what had happened. He would give them the news. And then, when the time was right, he would step aside and let her be seen. Let them see the woman who had helped make this possible. Stay behind me, he said. I will go first. Sarah nodded. She understood what he was offering. It was not just protection from the crowd. It was something deeper. It was his way of saying that he would carry the burden as he always had. He would stand in front and take whatever came, the questions, the fears, the hopes, the weight of it all, and she would be safe behind him, not because she was weak, but because he was strong enough to shield her. They rode into the camp. The people surrounded them. Red Hawk raised his hand and the crowd fell silent. He spoke. He told them about the letter. He told them about the ceasefire. He told them about the meeting at the fort. He told them that for 30 days they were safe. The camp erupted. Women cried. Men shouted. Children ran and laughed. Elders raised their hands to the sky and gave thanks. It was not a victory. Everyone knew that. The fight was not over. The negotiations would be long and difficult and might still fail. The soldiers were still there. The pressure to move to the reservation was still there. Nothing had been settled. But for now, for this moment, they were safe. And that was enough. In the days that followed, something changed in the camp's attitude toward Sarah. The suspicion that had surrounded her since her arrival began to dissolve. People who had avoided her now nodded to her as she passed. Women who had watched her with hard eyes now offered her food and smiled. The warriors who had argued for sending her away now acknowledged her presence with quiet respect. She had stood beside their chief. She had spoken on their behalf. She had helped buy them time, and they would not forget it. Morningstar was the most changed of all. She had always been brisk with Sarah, not unkind but not warm either. Now she was different. She talked to Sarah the way she talked to her own relatives, easily, openly, without the careful distance she had maintained before. She told Sarah stories about her late husband, about how they had met, about the day their first child was born. She laughed more. She touched Sarah's arm when she passed her in the teepee. Small gestures, but they meant the world. Red Hawk continued to lead. He prepared for the meeting at the fort with the same careful deliberation he brought to everything. He chose his advisors. He discussed strategy. He thought about what he would say, what he would ask for, what he would be willing to give up. He spent hours with the elders, listening to their wisdom, seeking their counsel, and he spent time with Sarah. Not long conversations. They were both too busy for that. But moments, a shared glance across the campfire, a word of encouragement before she went to bed. A brief exchange about the day's events as they sat together in the evening, watching the last light fade from the sky over the whispering water. The meeting at the fort would be complicated and difficult. There would be compromises that hurt and concessions that stung. The road ahead would be long and uncertain. But they had something that they had not had before. They had a chance for dialogue, a chance for understanding. a chance for something other than blood. And it had begun with a woman who had nothing left to give except her humility, and a chief who had the courage to step forward and say 3 words that changed everything. "Stay behind me." Years later, old women in the camp still told the story. They told it to their daughters and their granddaughters, sitting around fires on cold winter nights. They told the story of the white woman who knelt on the frozen ground. They told the story of the chief who rode toward 100 soldiers with nothing but a white flag and a necklace that had belonged to his father. They told the story of the 3 days when the whole world held its breath. And they told it not as a story about war or politics or the clash of civilizations. They told it as a love story, not the romantic kind. Something bigger than that. Something rarer. The kind of love that exists between 2 people who see each other clearly, who respect each other completely, and who stand together when everything around them is falling apart. Sarah Jennings never went back to Ohio. She lived the rest of her days among the Lakota, along the banks of the Whispering Water, in the shadow of the cottonwood trees. She learned to speak Lakota as fluently as she spoke English. She raised Morningstar's children as her own after Morningstar fell ill and passed away several years later. She grew old in that camp, and her hair turned white, and the children called her grandmother, and she was happy. And Red Hawk kept his promise. He kept all of his promises. He protected his people through years of negotiation and compromise and heartbreak. He never stopped fighting for them, though his weapons were words, not arrows. He never stopped believing that understanding was possible, even when the evidence suggested otherwise. He never stopped carrying the weight of 300 lives on his shoulders. And he never stopped looking at the world with those deep, steady eyes that saw the truth in everything and everyone. They are both gone now. The Whispering Water still flows over its smooth stones, still makes that soft, low sound that gave it its name. The cottonwood trees still stand along its banks, older and taller and more deeply rooted than they were in those long-ago days. The plains are different now. The buffalo are gone. The tippies are gone. The way of life that Red Hawk fought to preserve has changed in ways he could not have imagined, but the story remains. It lives in the mouths of the old ones. It lives in the memory of the land, and if you go to the Whispering Water on a cold winter evening, when the sky is clear and the stars are out, and the wind moves through the cottonwood trees like a whisper, you might hear it. The story of a woman who offered herself humbly, and a chief who stepped forward and said, "Stay behind me." And if you listen carefully, you will hear something else too. You will hear the sound of 2 hearts beating together in the darkness, steady and strong, like drums keeping time with the turning of the earth.